Okay, so let's move on to step 3. So I talked to you guys earlier about during when you're trying to determine your area of potential effect. So let's look a little deeper at that idea of effect and see what we're actually talking about when we're talking about effects. So what is an effect? Effect is basically any alteration to the characteristics of a historic property that qualify it for inclusion in or eligibility for the National Register. So direct effects are those that physically alter the characteristics of a property. So we talked about this earlier as well. And then indirect effects can be visual, atmospheric, or audible. So all of these constitute effects when we're talking about the assessment of effects. So we're also, so in addition to immediate effects, we're also talking about foreseeable effects that must be considered. I did talk about this as well a bit earlier. Just to reemphasize, we're not just talking about those immediate effects, but we have to take time into consideration because these indirect effects might occur in the future and may be foreseeable. And so we need to take those into consideration as well. It's important to keep in mind that effects are not always negative. What we're really talking about here, sort of the crux of this, is making a determination of whether or not the historic property is going to be adversely affected. And we'll talk more about what adverse effects are in a moment. So just wanted to point this out that not all effects are negative. And ultimately, in the process of consultation, the agency and the SHPO must agree on what the effects are. So in the process of assessing effects, the SHPO uses the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Archaeology and Historic Preservation as a guide. The intent of these standards is to assist with the long-term preservation of a property's significance through the preservation of historic materials and features. And so we have 4 treatments under the SOI standards, and this is in Amanda's area of expertise. So I'm going to turn it over to her. She's going to talk to you for a few slides here about these 4 treatments, and then I'll pick it back up.
Okay, so as you guys know, we have, gone through the other steps. So after we've established if there's a historic property, we have to figure out what effects the project will have on the property, like Jeffrey was saying. So we have 4 standards that the National Park Service has put out, and they have these really helpful guidelines that also go with it. The 4 standards are preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. And we're going to go over those in just a minute. But before we do that, I wanted to point out that generally it's a good idea to identify which standard you're planning for your project to be in so that I know which one to evaluate, which standard to apply to your project. So most of our projects are under rehabilitation, but that is not always the case. So especially if you're not under rehabilitation, let me know and we will evaluate them differently. There we go. Okay, sorry. Okay, so the first standard that we're going to talk about is preservation. And preservation is really when we are just trying to keep things the way they are right now. So as we have received them. It may not be a specific period. We're not trying to like return a property to a specific period or do anything like that. We are trying to keep things the way they are. So this is the act of applying measures necessary to sustain the existing form, integrity, and materials of the historic property. Most of the time, like I said, that's not necessarily what we're doing, but it is not uncommon for us to just try and preserve what we have. I think there's one more preservation slide. So what is within the scope of the project, excuse me, is just kind of maintaining things the way they are. We're not going to be able to do any exterior additions, not really much upgrading. We can like allow electrical and plumbing upgrades as needed in those situations to make it functional, but it is not upgrading it in any other sort of way. The next standard that we use, and like I said, this is the one most of our projects fall under, and that is rehabilitation. And this is, we have a property, it needs to be made useful. So we're going to repair it and alter it in ways that make it possible to be used. This is the one that allows us to change uses, change shapes of spaces, and functions in the building. So it's the most flexible and the one that most projects fall under. It allows for continued use, like I said. Oops, I thought there was another item there. Sorry. So there are options there for making additions, and the standards and with the illustrated guidelines explain to us how we do that and what is acceptable. There are also preservation briefs and technical notes that the National Park Service has put out that provide further guidance in addition to the standards that we use to try and determine if a project is in keeping with the Secretary of the Interior standards or not. And so this is kind of where, you know, a lot of people get caught up for projects. So while, you know, there's a lot of projects for window replacements, door replacements, things like that. You know, for historic properties in Missouri, we have an unwritten rule to repair front facing or street facing windows and doors, and then replacements that are not in kind. And by in kind, that means replacement with the same material, dimension, size. You know, all of the measurements are the same as the existing materials. And so it's just an in-kind replacement is what we call that. On the sides, like I said, and rear, if it's not a street-facing facade, then things are a little bit more flexible. I would just say that this is an unwritten rule that comes from quite a while ago, and I cannot say that we would like to get our program a little bit more in line with the Secretary of the Interior standards in future. So we might, you know, when we have time, we will be looking into ways to get this guidance more in line with the SOI standards, because that is not an acceptable treatment. If you're doing a tax credit project or any other project with our office, would that type of repair be acceptable? So we would like to look at that in the future, but I've been saying that for several years now. So one day, hopefully we'll get to it, but we won't be doing that without lots of consultation with you guys and discussing everything. So just to let you know, and a little bit about the flexibility there. So another item that we have, or another standard that we have, is restoration. And this is when we want to go to a particular period in time. So, you know, things have happened between now and when a particular event happened, but you might want to restore the look of a property to a certain period. Sometimes it's a particular time, like the example here at Ford's Theater. So it's been restored, the box anyway, has been restored to the period to look the same as it did when Lincoln was shot. And so that area has been restored to that period. You don't necessarily have to pick a period. You know, you don't have to pick one particular period, but you do have to justify your decision for a particular period that you'd like to restore a building to. It may be that a building hasn't really been occupied since the 1960s, so you want to restore it back to the way it was when it was last occupied, or in cases of house museums and, some National Park Service sites. They would like to interpret the site at a certain period in time. And so they use this standard to take that back to that period. This same thing here. There's a limited upgrading to mechanical and electrical and plumbing systems, just to what it's appropriate to make the property function. So there's no additions in this standard. If you were wanting to kind of do a hybrid, then you would be in in rehabilitation. And so something to think about is a lot of times people pick their word to describe what they're doing kind of at random, just based on their colloquial um, use of the word. But these are defined terms in the realm of historic preservation. And when you make your project submittal to our office, if you're telling me you're doing a restoration, you're actually telling me you're applying this standard. So you might actually be doing a rehabilitation. So you want to make sure that you list the appropriate items in your scope of work. And the last one is reconstruction. And this is when, an element or a whole property has been lost and we're going to restore it to a specific period. We discussed a little bit about that earlier, about how those can be eligible or contributing to historic districts or not. So most of Colonial Williamsburg is that sort of a thing. That's kind of the big example. And there's different ways that you can do reconstruction and different levels kind of to how much reconstruction you're going to do. And that should all be based on whatever documentation you have of the structure and not based on what you think or interpret or would like it to be. So you have to be really careful not to create a false sense of history in here. And that's what you're going to see a lot in notes from our office is we're concerned about whether or not we are, creating a false sense of history, especially when it comes to adding additions or doing a restoration or reconstruction. So we want to make sure that the things that we're doing are documented. If we're doing a restoration or a reconstruction, and if we're doing a rehabilitation and we are adding an addition, we want to make sure that the new is differentiated from the old, but not in a way that you're like, oh my gosh, that's a giant thing on there. So you want it to be compatible, but not replicate. So remodeling. Is remodeling a standard? There's no such standard for remodeling. Those are the four that we have. And so I am going to pass it back to Jeffrey.
All right, thank you, Amanda. So let's talk about determinations of effect. So one thing to say up front about DOEs, as they're sometimes called, is that making this determination is the responsibility of the federal agency. Now that means that these decisions are often made in concert with someone, perhaps like a consultant, who is actually out there in the world doing the assessment of historic properties and how they may be affected. So the federal agency can defer to the conclusions or the recommendations of those consultants, but ultimately it is the federal agency who is responsible for making the determination of effect. So I'll go over a few slides here that present some of the basically the three kinds of determinations of effects that we tend to see. So the first one that you guys often are happy to see, is that no historic properties are affected. So that basically means that no historic property is present in the APE, or there are historic properties present, but the undertaking will not have an effect on them. So that's an important caveat there. The second DOE could be no adverse effect. So this is when you have a property that is eligible for the National Register, is present in the APE, but the project following the Secretary of Interior standard is following the Secretary of the Interior standards, and it will not harm the integrity of the property. So basically, a National Register property is present in the project, but then the project has been designed in some way to where that undertaking will have no adverse effect on that property, despite it being present. And then the third is adverse effect. So this means that basically when we've arrived at this point, this means the project will significantly harm the integrity of the historic property or alter the characteristics that qualify it for the National Register. So let's dig a little deeper into what is an adverse effect. And so this is the definition straight from the regulations. It occurs when an undertaking may directly or indirectly alter the characteristics of a historic property. Basically, its qualifying characteristics. As we've mentioned earlier, reasonably foreseeable effects caused by the undertaking that may occur later in time or are farther removed in distance or are cumulative also need to be considered. So we keep repeating this, but this because these are some important points about taking into effect both direct and indirect effects and thinking about whether or not any of these represent an adverse effect to the property in question. So some examples of an adverse effect, obviously physical destruction or damage to all or part of the property, any kind of alteration that's inconsistent with what's laid out in the Secretary of the Interior standards, a relocation of the property, removing it from that historic context, any change in the character of the property's use or setting, any kind of introduction of incompatible visual, atmospheric, or audible elements, or simply neglect and deterioration, or in other words, deferred maintenance. And then finally, the transfer, lease, or sell out of federal control without adequate preservation restrictions. So this is an important question. I believe someone asked some version of this earlier. What if the agency and the SHPO do not agree on effects? So if we do agree on effects, basically the normal 106 process proceeds. If the agency, the federal agency, disagrees with the SHPO, then the advisory council must be consulted. Advisory council has 15 days to respond, and then basically the agency takes that response and takes that opinion of the ACHP into consideration when making their final decision. So again, just a part of that consultation process where we have to all talk about the determination of effects as well. So unanticipated discoveries. This is something that's important to keep into mind for everyone, agency people, consultants, this possibility of things appearing at a later date that you did not anticipate, especially obviously historic properties. So basically, if any historic properties are discovered or any effects on historic properties occur after the completion of the 106 process, basically what's required of the agency is to make a reasonable effort to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse effects. It's very important that when these unanticipated discoveries occur, that work be stopped. You contact the appropriate agency official, certainly contact us at SHPO, and any other interested parties that may be required by the law. We'll talk later about unanticipated discovery of human remains and other sort of special situations and how to respond to those kinds of discoveries specifically. Okay, so we will take a moment here for any questions before we go any further. So if anybody, let's see, I figured out a way to actually pull up my chat box so I can read if anybody has any questions. Let's see. Yes, thanks, Karen, for providing the link there. You can check the ACHP's link on effects for more information. And I'll say that generally, ACHP is certainly a good place to go to. They have a lot of good information on their website related to every aspect of the 106 process we're talking about here today. What's the deal with the last picture? I believe that was the
So
picture you inserted, Amanda. You want to talk about that one?
yeah, sure. So sometimes within the walls of your building, you might find out that your building is older than you previously thought, or that there is a remnant of a building that you were like, I don't really know if that was in place. And so you might often run into a situation where you go to take out a wall and you find out it is a log cabin in there, or in this case, this is a the vertical boards in the wall. And so at that case, we need to stop and evaluate if there is criterion D potential with the structure. And then we might also need to say, hey, this property is a lot older than we thought it was. And so that's a point where you would go ahead and say, hey, let me reach out to SHPO and see what they think about this finding.
Yeah, so anticipated discoveries can certainly be diverse. As an archaeologist, I tend to be biased and think more towards archaeological deposits or human remains that may not have been identified during the original survey, those as unanticipated discoveries, but there's far many others than just that.
I think it's also relevant to point out here that if you discover something, it's not a bad thing. And John has posted a question asking if that's a situation where we've got 30 days to respond. And my answer would be, if you find something like this in the wall or an unanticipated discovery, call us. Send us an email. We'll talk with you right now
Mhm.
because you've got your contractor on site. You're in the middle of your project. This is not a situation where you can sit around and wait 30 days.
Yes, good point. Pick up a phone in this instance. Don't rely on an email. Certainly don't mail in a notice to us. Yeah, get in touch with us as quickly as you possibly can so we can expedite the process for you as best we can. Is there anything else? Okay, hearing none, I will advance the slide for Amanda and she can pick it up at